Have you ever felt out of place in an ordinary conversation, as if you were only present on the outside while your mind remained somewhere else? Have you noticed that certain interactions feel like repeated rituals, not real connections? Maybe you are not distant because of shyness. Maybe you are distant because you see too much. Because silence for you is not emptiness. There is a discomfort that few people can name. Being surrounded by others and still feeling that nothing there touches the depth where your soul lives. As if the world spoke a language that is far too superficial. And the more you think, the harder it becomes to pretend interest in the trivial. The awakened mind is not nourished by noise. What if the reason you prefer solitude is not weakness but clarity? What if your withdrawal is not rejection but lucidity? Schopenhauer believed that the more intelligent someone becomes, the less they can tolerate social superficiality, because there comes a point when the masks become too visible to ignore. This video is not for everyone. It is for those who feel a strange peace when they are alone and a strange exhaustion when they are surrounded by noise. For those who do not seek crowds, but meaning. Stay until the end, because the final truth we explore may completely transform the way you understand your loneliness. Arthur Schopenhauer was one of the most direct and unsettling philosophers in history. He did not write to comfort. He wrote to cut through illusions. He saw the social world not as a place of harmony, but as a stage filled with characters, distractions, and invisible games. And few had the courage to say this with such cold clarity. For Schopenhauer, most people do not seek company for depth. They seek it out of fear. Fear of silence. Fear of being alone with themselves. That is why society fills itself with conversation, entertainment, constant noise. Because silence forces you to think, and thinking, for many, is unbearable. That is why intelligent minds often withdraw. Not out of hatred for people, but out of love for truth. They realize early that much of social life is performance, that many encounters are merely exchanges of validation. And once you see the theater behind the smile, continuing to act becomes impossible. The loneliness of the thinker is not a curse, it is a sign that you do not belong to the noise, but to clarity. And throughout this video, we will enter the harsh truth Schopenhauer left behind, that solitude is not an absence of life, but the only place where the deep mind can finally breathe and be whole. Think for a moment about why silence is so unbearable for most people. Why does the ordinary mind rush toward noise, toward conversation, toward any stimulus that prevents it from being alone with itself? Schopenhauer saw this not as strength, but as weakness, because those who cannot endure their own thoughts depend on the world to escape from themselves. The common man seeks external life the way a starving person seeks food, not to nourish the soul, but to flee. Social life becomes a constant flow of voices, laughter, gossip, and movement, not because it is profound, but because stillness reveals too much, and most people fear what silence might expose within them. But the intelligent person is different, not because they are superior, but because their inner world is already alive. Their mind does not need external stimulation to feel real. In solitude, they do not feel empty. They feel full. They do not experience loneliness as punishment, but as space, as breath, as freedom. Schopenhauer saw solitude as the natural habitat of depth. When you truly think, you begin to notice how shallow many interactions are. Small talk, repeated jokes, trivial comments. Everything starts to sound like mental pollution. Not something evil, just exhausting, like being forced to listen to static. And perhaps you have felt this too. A strange fatigue after a social gathering, not because someone hurt you, but because nothing touched the level where your mind lives. The more you observe, the more you realize that much conversation is not about truth, but about filling space, about avoiding silence. The deeper the mind becomes, the less it can pretend. You can smile, agree, participate, but something inside you knows it is theater. And this awareness creates distance, because intelligence does not abandon society out of hatred. It withdraws because it cannot survive on superficiality without losing itself. Schopenhauer believed that the common man cannot endure his own company. That is why he seeks crowds. That is why he fears solitude. Because being alone forces confrontation, forces reflection, removes distractions. And most people would rather be surrounded by noise than face the unanswered questions within their own existence. But the thinking soul begins to desire what others avoid. Silence becomes nourishment. A quiet room becomes more honest than a crowded party. A walk alone feels more real than dozens of empty conversations. Because in solitude you are not performing. You are simply being. And that is rare in the modern world. That is why gossip becomes unbearable to the intelligent mind. Not because it is beneath them, but because it is irrelevant. It carries no depth, no transformation, no truth. It is sound without substance. And when you begin to hunger for meaning, the trivial becomes painful. You can no longer unsee the emptiness. The intelligent person discovers that their energy is sacred. Every social obligation is a tax on attention. Every forced interaction is a dilution of clarity. And slowly, without rebellion, without arrogance, they begin to step back. Not to isolate out of contempt, but to protect the inner world where their real life happens. And here is the paradox. The more you think, the more solitude feels like home. Not because you reject humanity, but because you reject noise. You understand that many do not seek connection, but distraction. They seek validation. And an awakened mind cannot feed on that without feeling spiritually hungry. Because the moment you realize that silence is not emptiness but clarity, something even more unsettling appears. Social life is not merely interaction. It is constant adaptation, adjustment, mask, performance. And when you begin to see the invisible theater behind every smile, it becomes impossible to keep acting. There comes a moment when you realize that social life is rarely spontaneous. Almost everything requires adjustment. A smile at the right time, an automatic agreement, a rehearsed phrase to avoid discomfort. Schopenhauer saw this as an invisible theater, where each person learns early that being accepted requires acting, not simply existing. Most interactions do not happen for truth, but for convenience. You say what others expect to hear, laugh at what you do not find funny, take part in rituals that mean nothing. And the more conscious you become, the harder it is to ignore this. Because the deep mind feels the weight of falseness like a constant pressure in the chest. Schopenhauer believed that the social man fragments himself in order to survive. He shapes himself, adapts, distorts. Not because he is evil, but because he fears exclusion. Group life demands subtle masks. And the tragedy is that after so long performing, many forget who they are without the stage. Think of how many times you have censored yourself in silence. How many times you swallowed a truth to keep the peace. How many times you softened your essence to seem more normal. This is performance. This is the dilution of the self. And Schopenhauer said that the more intelligent someone is, the faster they perceive the psychological cost of this act. The intelligent person sees ego games with uncomfortable clarity. They notice when a conversation is merely a contest for status, when a compliment is a currency, when a meeting is a silent exchange of validation. And once you see this, it is like seeing the strings behind the spectacle. You can no longer pretend innocence. Society rewards those who fit in, not those who are true. It celebrates appearance, not depth. That is why so many live as characters. And the thinker experiences this as suffocation. Because for them, every mask is a distance between the soul and the world. And living distant from yourself is a slow form of inner death. Schopenhauer saw social life as an arena of expectations. You must be pleasant, interesting, accessible. You must react at the right rhythm. But what if your nature is not noise? What if your mind asks for silence? The intelligent begin to realize that for many, socializing is not meeting. It is emotional obligation disguised as company. And here exhaustion emerges, not physical fatigue, but existential fatigue. The feeling of always translating your soul into a superficial language, realizing that most people do not want depth, they want comfort, they want distraction. And when you do not participate in the theater, your presence becomes unsettling, like a mirror that reveals too much. The strangest part is that almost no one admits it. Everyone pretends it is natural, everyone follows the script. But the awakened mind notices the repetitions, the patterns, the empty phrases. It sees that many relationships are built on fear. Fear of silence, fear of not being seen, fear of not belonging. And this fear holds the entire stage together. Schopenhauer said that the common man lives turned outward, seeking in the gaze of others the confirmation that he exists. That is why social life becomes addiction. But the intelligent begin to break this cycle. They understand that depending on approval is being a prisoner, and the freer they become, the stranger they appear in the eyes of the group. Because there is something threatening about someone who does not need to perform, something unsettling about someone who does not beg for acceptance. The person who does not bow to social rituals becomes an enigma, and the enigma intimidates. Schopenhauer saw this with brutal clarity. Most people do not hate your solitude, they hate the fact that you do not need them to feel whole. And then you begin to choose, not out of contempt, but out of lucidity. You realize that every encounter demands an edited version of yourself, and that this is costly. The deep mind prefers a few real connections over many empty performances, because being truly seen is rare, and acting all the time is a waste of life. The social mask may seem light, but it grows heavy over time. It demands an invisible price: anxiety, fragmentation, loss of authenticity. Schopenhauer said that the more someone has within themselves, the less they need to seek outside. And when you recognize this, the theater loses its shine. You begin to desire something more honest than applause, because the moment you stop acting, something is revealed with silent clarity. Solitude is not rejection, it is freedom. It is the only place where you do not need to adapt, explain yourself, or diminish yourself. And perhaps that is exactly why some abandon the world, not to flee from it, but to finally become whole. There is a profound difference between abandoning the world and finally freeing yourself from it. Schopenhauer said that a man can only be himself while he is alone, because only in solitude does the self not need to justify itself. There is no stage, no expectation, no applause. There is only presence. And for the intelligent mind, this is not emptiness. It is return. Many interpret solitude as coldness, as rejection, as isolation. But Schopenhauer saw the opposite. For him, withdrawal is not born from contempt, but from sensitivity. The intelligent feel too much, perceive too much, absorb too much. And social noise, with its masks and demands, becomes a constant invasion of the soul. Chosen solitude is not escape. It is protection. It is a space where you do not need to adapt in order to fit, where you do not need to translate your depth into small phrases, where you do not need to laugh out of obligation. Schopenhauer believed that freedom begins when you do not depend on the presence of others to feel real. Think of how much social life demands invisible concessions. You give pieces of yourself in exchange for belonging. You silence truths to maintain harmony. You shrink yourself so as not to disturb. And then one day you realize that this is not connection. It is negotiation. Solitude, on the other hand, demands nothing. It simply allows you to be. Schopenhauer said that the more someone possesses within themselves, the less they need to seek outside. This is not arrogance. It is inner independence. The deep mind is not nourished by applause. It is nourished by clarity. And clarity is rarely born in crowds. It is born in silence, where consciousness can breathe without interruption. That is why intelligent people prefer a few real connections. They do not reject love. They reject superficiality. They do not despise people. They despise the theater. Because empty relationships drain more than loneliness. And Schopenhauer saw this as a brutal truth. Being surrounded does not mean being accompanied. Solitude reveals something society tries to hide. It shows that most noise is fear. Fear of not being seen, fear of not being accepted, fear of being alone with yourself. But the intelligent, by remaining in silence, discover that this fear is a collective prison, and that leaving it is an act of spiritual courage. There comes a point where you can no longer return. After you experience the peace of not needing to please, the old social game loses meaning. Trivial conversations seem absurd. External validation seems small. And you understand that freedom is not in being part of everything, but in needing nothing in order to exist fully. Schopenhauer saw solitude as a privilege reserved for those who can endure truth. Because being alone means facing your thoughts without distraction. It means hearing your deepest questions. It means confronting emptiness until it transforms into meaning. Many flee from this, but those who remain awaken. And when you awaken, you realize that solitude is not absence, it is expanded presence. It is in silence that you begin to notice the world with clarity, nature, art, philosophy, existence itself. You connect not with social noise, but with something greater. Schopenhauer would say that this is true companionship. The intelligent do not abandon the world because they are incapable of love. They abandon it because they love truth too much to live in falseness. They feel too much to endure superficiality. They seek depth the way one seeks air. And so solitude becomes the place where their essence is not diluted, but preserved. Society calls this loneliness, but Schopenhauer would call it sovereignty. Because the man who does not need others' approval is free. He is not manipulated by invitations, by looks, by expectations. He chooses, and choosing is the beginning of conscious life. Solitude is not punishment, it is autonomy. And here is the final paradox. The more whole you become alone, the more powerful your presence becomes when you return. You do not speak to be accepted, you speak with purpose. You do not connect out of need, you connect out of abundance. Solitude does not diminish the deep human being, it strengthens them. Schopenhauer believed that most people live anesthetized by distraction, but the thinker lives awake, and living awake hurts, because you see too much. But it also frees you. You can no longer pretend that the trivial is enough. You can no longer sacrifice your soul for empty company, and this renunciation is the beginning of truth. If you have ever felt guilty for needing silence, for refusing invitations, for not fitting in, perhaps you are confusing freedom with defect. Perhaps your solitude is not weakness, but a calling. Schopenhauer would say, some were born for noise, others were born for clarity. And clarity requires distance. In the end, solitude is not rejection. It is a sacred return. A space where you meet yourself without masks, without noise, without theater. Where you become the author of your own life, not a supporting character in others' expectations. And when the world asks why you withdrew, perhaps the answer is simple. Because in silence you finally heard yourself. In the end, Schopenhauer's harsh truth is simple. Most people live to belong. The intelligent live to understand. One seeks crowds so as not to feel empty. The other seeks silence so as not to lose themselves. And when you understand this, you realize that social withdrawal is not a personality flaw, but the price of lucidity. Because the more you see, the less you can pretend, the less you can perform. The less you can be satisfied with distractions that numb the world. The deep mind does not abandon society out of coldness. It withdraws because it feels too much to survive in superficiality. And this sensitivity is both a burden and a revelation. This does not mean living isolated, hating people, or rejecting all connection. Schopenhauer did not advocate misanthropy. He advocated clarity. He advocated choice. The difference between loneliness and solitude lies in this. One is involuntary abandonment. The other is conscious freedom. It is choosing depth instead of noise. Most people cannot endure being with themselves. That is why they need constant noise, constant validation, constant presence. But perhaps you have discovered something rare. That silence is not emptiness. That solitude is not punishment. That inner peace is not born from others' approval, but from the integrity of not betraying yourself in order to fit. And here is the final paradox. The more whole you become alone, the more real your presence becomes when you return. You do not speak out of need. You speak out of truth. You do not connect out of lack. You connect out of abundance. Solitude does not diminish the intelligent. It strengthens them and returns them to the world with clarity. Perhaps you are not alone because you failed to fit in. Perhaps you are alone because you saw too much. Because you noticed the masks, the games, the silent theater. And once you see, there is no way to fall asleep again. Awakening has a cost, but it also has a reward, inner freedom. Schopenhauer would say that the awakened mind does not need crowds in order to exist. It needs truth. It needs space. It needs silence. And if you feel that you do not belong to the noise, perhaps that is not a defect. Perhaps it is a calling, a sign that your soul was made for depth, not distraction. If this truth resonated with you, leave a comment with the phrase, "Silence is clarity." Not for us, but so that others may know they are not broken, only awakening. And remember, solitude is not your weakness. It is your strength. It is the place where you finally hear yourself, and everything begins there.